is a quick live feed just to sort of have basically answer a question that's come up on my comment on my unraid stuff. So a guy called, I'll give you a shout out, Kevin G, emailed me a question about he's got 4 SSD, 480 gigabytes each. Is there a requirement for cache in the unraid build as all the disks are SSD and no mechanical hard drives? Would it be an advantage? Will there be for other users accessing disk data, etc.? Right, I find out on the you can't just install like 2 disks and that's it. You've got to at least have 4 drives because you need to satisfy the array devices and the cache devices, because I've learned on this new one I just built that if I leave the array devices unconfigured and just configure the cache devices, UnRaid doesn't allow it to mount or start. So you've got to have a minimum at least 4 drives, I think it is. So in this one, I could be standing correctly, but in the one I've particularly done, which I'm just looking at the moment on the screen here, so I've got an array device with 2 SSDs, and so the array device is what you call the long-term storage devices, where you'll like store data and stuff. Because it's going to be SSD based, it doesn't really matter on the SSD speed side, because you're also going to have super tremendous speed anyway from mechanical hard drives. So what I would do, the cache device is always like where everything is like stored and then moved on, but in that way you won't need to worry about that. So I would set up a cache device with 2 disks minimum, so at least you've got a cache and a working drive, so if something goes wrong, data is still safe. Eventually I'll put 3 in on mine on the cache devices, so that's where all my VMs sit. So UnRaid creates some folders, and they're basically called apps data, domains, ISOS systems. Now all that relies on the cache device, because you will not need that all to be super quick. So the main folders that UnRaid works with. Your domain folder is where VMs store, where your virtual desktops, your VMs, I don't know how there's not, whatever you want to call it, that's where they store. Apps data again is part of UnRaid, and the ISOS is where you store your live image files for creating or booting Windows. So that's why I keep those files. So I keep them on the cache drives so that when I install and create a new VM, I can install it really quickly and really fast on that side. So that's where I will store those on the cache devices. Then on the data side, which is the array side, I will put again input. You can put 2 SSDs in there. So the first one will be your parity drive, and the second one will be the actual working drive. Depends on the size of the drive, so it depends how much data you want accessible to your users for creating user shares and stuff. So at the moment in my system, I've got 2 drives in there, 1 parity and 1 disk, and that gives me a total of 1 terabyte, because they're both 1 terabyte SSDs. So one you can't, well, both drives you can't count them together because one is acts as a parity drive. But I would put 4 in there, so 2 cache, 4 array devices, and then the array devices where I would store users' datas, their shares, things like that, working data on there itself. And there's a little option when you got like folders set up, and or you create folders. There's also a thing called use cache disk. So on your shares, you wouldn't have to worry about that because it's on SSD anyways. It doesn't really matter. But UnRaid is, I think UnRaid when it was first I think built, they were building it as like very much like cache is always SSD because you need to be fast and quick, and your array devices will always be mechanical disks in there. But again, people are changing things rapidly. People are now going full SSD because it's getting more cheaper to do that. So that's why these little use cache disk options are, there for use. So if you are using your array as mechanical disks, and you want to cache the users folders, and then every night it writes it to the mechanical disks afterwards, then you could put on there saying use disks prefer or yes, and then what it does, it writes to the SSD all day long, and then at end of night it will then do what you call it does a move command and sends it across to the mechanical disks. So any used data or current data it'll reside on the SD for the day and then move across. You can set it change differently as well, because I find if your user's got a large folder and it's like using they're saving stuff all the time, uploading stuff to all the time, you've got to make sure your cache pool disks are large, very large, for that to handle that data. So you need to work out what your users' average data allowance for the day is. How much data do they actually consume per day. Then you make sure your cache disks are that high. Plus, if you're running VMs on it, also add that in as well on that side. Because roughly a Windows 10 VM, it would be about 90 meg. 90 gigabyte of storage it will use up. That's the basic stuff, and that covers your Windows updates as well, and a few of applications. Again, you increase that size depends what you're running on your virtual disk as well. On Windows 10, where you've got lots of applications running, then you need to increase that slightly. And obviously think about future updates for Windows. Windows always updating, always adding to the system all the time. So you got to make sure you fill that in. So I would say just to cover most applications, 100 gigabytes as a temporary storage for VMs. But I'll go into more details on that because I'm going to be covering how to set up VMs, how to run them and stuff. You asked a question a bit about where you want to be running VMware Pro running hosted 2016 server. Don't bother. Why buy another bit of software which is going to cost you a little bit of money? Run it on UnRaid. UnRaid will run VM with Windows 2000 Server because UnRaid supports quite a lot of devices. I'm just going to get up on the screen here. So add VM in there. So UnRaid, when you create a VM, it supports Windows 10, Windows 8.x, Windows 7, Windows XP. It also supports Windows Server 2016, Server 2012, Windows Server 2008, and Windows Server 2003. Then you've got other things like Linux, Arch, COS, Chrome OS. There you go, Chrome OS. You can build a Chrome OS as well. Cool. Core OS, and there's 100 different flavors of Linux on there as well that supports Steam OS as well. You can customize a VM build, but they're the main templates that UnRaid supports. So I wouldn't even bother running VMware because I had the VMware. I decided, well, why am I paying for this bit of software where UnRaid is part of it? VM is part of UnRaid. They have their own flavor of it. It works fine. I've been running my Windows 2016 server for a couple of years now on UnRaid. It's been fantastic for all the upgrade versions. No issues, no problems at all. So I that's what I would suggest to do is don't worry about running VMware Pro. Literally load your 2016 server on UnRaid and do it all from there. Again, make sure it's on the cache pool disk, and it should be fine. It's super fast, super quick. Assign enough CPU, assign enough RAM to it as well. Perfect. And if you've got one of these Ryzen processors that have got multi-core and you've got like 20 cores in there, then great. You can run your virtual environments with like lots of cores, lots of CPU, lots of RAM. Perfect. So again, I'm looking at very much later on to upgrade my servers to have more cores and more RAM usage, because most of my boxes will only do 32 gigabyte of RAM and a maximum of 8 cores, but I need to take that to the next level. CPU, so I need to build a new system. So I'm going to look at building a system that maybe double my cores, so maybe 16 cores, and definitely doubling my RAM memory to at least 64 or 128, because then that should make my virtual machines a lot faster. I can assign a lot more RAM to it. But hopefully that answers your questions. If not, I've got some more stuff coming up, which hopefully then will answer your questions. Any questions you got, please do comment below. Hit that subscribe button, hit the notification button, thumbs up if you like these videos, thumbs down if you don't like these videos. And I'll hopefully see you on the next video very soon. Cheers, bye.